Good morning and welcome to the channel. Hi, I'm Jim from Whatnot Adventures. I hope you're having a good day. We are having an absolutely great day here. It's sunny, it's warm, and we are in Augusta, Georgia at the Meadow Gardens. This place is was the home of George Walton, one of the Georgia signers of the Declaration of Independence. We're going to take a tour of the house and the grounds and see what there is to see. I've already talked to the staff. They're going to allow me to take snippets of video on the tour and just give you an idea so that you can come down here and see this wonderful place for yourself. So let's go.
The home of George Walton. He is one of the youngest signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was only 26 when he signed the Declaration. All the white wigs leave us thinking everybody was an old man, but there were definitely some young rebels, and there George was one of those. He lived here at Meadow Garden, not at the time he signed the Declaration, but after the Revolution. He was here from 1791 until 1804. Strangely enough, when he was here, it was not in a hospital parking lot with the modern sculpture out front, and usually we have some helicopters going by and an ambulance or two. But this was, when the Waltons were here, 121 and a half acres of farmland spreading out all around us. Over that little rise you see, that's the Augusta Canal. That wasn't here until 1845, so this was very different. It was a good-sized family farm on the very outskirts of Augusta. And though the land was a lot bigger, the house was a lot smaller. So if you come over this way, you can see. We always start out here so you can see the two staircases and the two front doors. This is because in its earliest period, when the Waltons lived here, they lived just in this section with the lower porch. So you see what is now beside the canal, on the canal side. So this would have been the entirety of the Waltons' house. It had at least 2 rooms on the bottom floor, 2 rooms on the top floor. And it may have had some rooms where the porches are now, what would be now the front and back. Actually, we've had a preservation team that's worked with us for about the last 8 or 9 years, and as they've done different projects with us, they've kept finding things that didn't make sense, curiosities, like why are these abandoned mortises here? They did some work on the porch, like it looks like this used to be an interior wall. Why is this, lots of different things. Said it was one of the most complicated houses they'd ever worked on. And as they were doing work on this canal side, they took off some of the siding and they looked and saw the floor joists from the upstairs floor were set differently than they expected and had been sort of chopped off in a way and they stood there and said, well, you never would have done this unless the roof went the other way. So in its earliest period, we would be looking at the side of the house, and the front of the house would have been on what's now the canal side. You'll see a little bit more about that as we go in. It's a little bit confusing, but again, the house just at least 2 rooms on the bottom floor, 2 on the top, looking out away from town into what George himself called his Meadow Garden. So he would write these letters and he'd say, I'm planting so much corn and so much of the best cotton, and then he would tell you, then he'd talk about the people, and he would sign it George Walton of Meadow Garden. So the name that he gave it is a name we still use today. Now, while the house was very small, in this period, many of the things that are in our houses, like our kitchen and our laundry room, were separate buildings they called dependencies. So there would have been, the buildings you see here now are new buildings that we built in the last large building. The Heritage Education Center was built in 2004. The restroom is just getting completed. And those are built to be sympathetic with the historic house. But the Waltons would have had similar buildings. They would have had dependencies. And this is where you would have done all of the hard work of the household. So today is a hot, sunny day. You wouldn't want to be standing over a fire. You wouldn't want that in your house in this warm climate. So they would have had a kitchen building, a scullery where they'd do washing, a laundry maybe, a milk barn or a dairy, a smokehouse, barns, carriage houses, whatever they needed would be in separate workspaces away from the house. And the work in these places would have been done by the 14 enslaved that we know were at Meadow Garden. George wrote this deed of trust in 1801, and he gives us the names and the ages and the family relationships of 14 people held here in slavery. And he says that, well, they are the property of my wife, Dorothy, inherited from her family to be passed down to our children. These people treated as property, nothing to do with me. Now, whether he made this big pronouncement because, they were high social standing but often in debt, was it to preserve those people as property? Was it because of his feelings about slavery? And if so, he never wrote and told us anything about his convictions in that regard. But we do know there was a book by a noted abolitionist in the household as of 1803. So we do wonder. And sometimes history is about putting together all these pieces of this puzzle, and sometimes you find a piece that makes it even more confusing. But this deed of trust does give us a lot of information. It is never enough. These people that have very little control over their life sometimes leave a very small footprint. But we are very, very thankful to have their names, their ages, and their family relationships, because they were so much a part of the tapestry of any home, and so much a part of Meadow Garden in its early days. So we're going to go up into the newer part of the house. New being 1835. So for a long time, we did not know when the extension was built. No one helpfully wrote, now I shall build an extension on the house where George Walton once lived. But we could tell that it had been built later. You can tell by the way the boards are milled, by the types of nails that are used. The windows are larger. Even the window panes are larger. Lots of indications that this was built at a later date. But again, we knew all of the people who'd owned the house. George Walton lived here until his death in 1804. At that time, his one surviving son took over the property. And he was in Augusta until about 1821. And then we knew, that the house passed through a number of different hands. But a few years ago, we did a study called dendrochronology. So we had an expert come in, and they took little samples of the wood throughout the structure. And if you get the right sample, you can use that sample and do tests to find out when those trees were cut down. So we did this throughout the house, and we found a floor joist on this side, a pretty foundational piece of this part, the extension, that was from a tree cut down the winter of 1834 and 1835. So that was very specific, much more specific than I really thought they could be. It was wonderful, though, because we know that a grocer named Matthew Nelson purchased the property in 1834. He sold the best groceries bought by steamboat. So there he was, bought the property in 1834, and almost certainly started cutting down trees to build this extension. And he made a lot of changes to the house, and we'll talk about that a little as we go along. But when he bought it, it was still a family farm. Now, 10 years later, the Augusta Canal comes along, and that is Augusta's economic development plan. We're right on the fall line, so with that canal, we could produce energy in the 1840s. And so along comes all of this industry. We got all of these mills and factories, and the Confederate powder works are stretched along this canal. So much came in to take advantage of that energy production. And with it, the farmland was gradually sold off. They expanded the canal in the 1870s. And by 1888, I think it was, you probably parked out in our front parking lot. That would have been the Augusta Brewing Company making Belle of Georgia beer. They made Belle of South Carolina and Belle of Florida, too. They were equal opportunity. And they also shipped beer to Cuba. So it must have been a really big enterprise. So different Nelsons have inherited the property throughout the later 1800s. And eventually, they decided they didn't want to live behind a brewery anymore. In 1894, they put the house on the market. You can see a picture up here of the house around that time in the 1880s. It's really in bad shape. It's, again, not in a residential area. It's really surrounded by these factories and mills. And when it went on the market, it was really in danger of being torn down. But the Daughters of the American Revolution had just been founded. The group here was organized in 1892. And those ladies immediately went to work raising money to save the home of a signer of the Declaration. They did not even have the right to vote, and they decided, I'm going to do this. It was not quick or easy. It took them 6 years to raise enough money. But they purchased the property, and that is opening day, November 21st, 1901, when we opened to the public as a historic house museum, and we've been open ever since. So you're part of a very long tradition today as we tour the house. And there they all dressed up. So we love that we have that image from opening day and love that we can follow in their footsteps. The house is still owned and operated by the Georgia State Society Daughters of the American Revolution. So we're going to come on in to the oldest part of the house. This is the part where the Waltons would have lived 230 years ago. Again, you can tell that the Nelsons made a lot of changes when they built the extension. And we are open through all of our preservation. We're a little bit of a lab for preservation because after 120 years, if we closed every time we had to do something to take care of the house, we'd never see anybody. So as you can see, our house is not wearing all its clothes. There was a time, I think it was in the 1950s or so, when someone thought that everything new is better than everything old, and a noted architect came in and put up some beautiful modern plaster, because modern's best to, show this beautiful image of the past. It's what they thought was the best at the time. And sometimes we do peel back layers of best intentions through, but we have taken off some of that non-period plaster to look at the framing, and it's such a treat. You can see the plaster and lath that was probably put there in 1835 when that went from being an exterior wall to an interior wall. When the Nelsons built their extension, they cut the doors into the hallway that they were constructing. They plastered over the original front door and the passage between the rooms, and we'll talk a little bit more about what went on over here as we get to the next room. But one of our upcoming projects is very exciting. We'll be putting in 18th century appropriate plaster and illusions of the windows. So we'll be closing the space in so that you feel what the Waltons would have felt. It's a little claustrophobic thinking about all the people that would have lived in just this small space. It's a very different sense of place for us. So we're not going to tear down the extension. We're going to keep that, and it's part of the history of the house as well. But we are going to bring in and get this part of the house as close as possible to what the Waltons would have experienced whenever we can find definitive evidence of what that was. We're going to try our best to get it there. So the preservation team, thank goodness, they put up that blue tape to show us where the windows were. They can really come in and just read the house, and it's so exciting to see and hear about how they make their discoveries about what the house has gone through during its lifetime. So I'll talk about that as we go along. I will say all of the furniture that you see, the vast majority does date to 1821 or earlier. However, we don't have any items that have a provenance going back to the Walton family, when the time they lived here. We have some other items from the family, but from a later period. And we'll talk about why that might be as we go along, but we do try to minimize contact with all the old pieces. Some of these, like the pianoforte, have been in our collection since the very first inventory in 1909. But in each room, there is those Windsor chairs. If you need to sit down or set anything down, those black chairs are safe. You will have been doing inventory. Some of these pieces are rather delicate, but we do try to minimize contact with those. But now I want to introduce you to our George here, George Walton. He's right here over my shoulder. So none of our Georgia signers of the Declaration of Independence were born here in Georgia. We were the baby sister of the colonies, founded in 1732. And George was born up in Virginia. And we don't even have a specific birth date for him. Again, history is about putting together those puzzles, and we had to collect different bits of information to try to define the time that George was probably born. And we know he was born sometime between September 1749 and February of 1750. Part of how we know that is because his father died around the time of his birth. And by the time George was just 7 years old, all four of the Walton children, listed as orphans of Robert Walton, and George was the youngest of those four, were given guardians. And so we feel his mother probably died. George and his siblings were probably orphaned by the time he was 7 years old. Now, the two oldest boys went to live with an uncle, and George and his sister Sally, who's his closest sibling in age, they went to live with this lady over here. This is Aunt Martha. And Aunt Martha and Uncle George had 13 children of their own. Not all of them when George and Sally went to stay, but they did grow up with a bunch of cousins. So that may be why George decided at the age of 14 to apprentice with a builder. This was pretty typical at this age. If you wanted to do just about anything, you found someone who had that job and you made an agreement to work under them. So George made an agreement with Christopher Ford to serve as his apprentice and learn to be a builder. And the guardianship documents have been really valuable too, because there are references to the things that the guardians purchase for those in their care. For George, we see books and schoolmasters. which lets us know he already had an education when he went into this apprenticeship. And he stays stays in that apprenticeship for only about 5 years. And then in 1769, we see George leave everything he's ever known, leave Virginia, and come down to Georgia, not here to Augusta, but to Savannah. So George goes to Savannah, and there he apprentices again with a lawyer named Henry Young. Now, there were no law schools yet, so just like being a builder, if you wanted to be a lawyer, you had to read the law under a trained lawyer to learn that career as well. We think this is probably why George migrated. Again, he didn't have a lot of money or important friends or university education like Thomas Jefferson, so it would be really hard for him to find that opportunity to apprentice in the law in very formal Virginia. But Georgia is kind of a land of opportunity at this point, so we think that's what brought him here. Again, he did go down to Savannah first, started doing work under Henry Young, and by 1774, George took an oath to the king in order to practice law independently. We were still a colony, and if you wanted to have this job, this is what you did. But we've already seen that George doesn't always, fall in with expectations. He's already gone out on his own, proved he's very intrepid and willing to make his own opportunities. So George starts going down to the local tavern named Tondy's Tavern, and they have, just like it says on the label, they have Tondy's Long Room. So this is a big meeting room where people are gathering to talk about the situation with Britain. We have no representation in Parliament, and yet here we are. We're taxed. In some colonies, they have to quarter soldiers in their own homes. We can't ship things the way we want. We can't buy the products we want. And they had no say in any of these decisions without representation in Parliament. And as they spoke about these things, 250 years ago tomorrow, George stepped up with some other gentlemen and put his name on a call for people to come to a provincial congress and speak about these issues in a formal way. Again, it tells us a couple things. It tells us George was well known enough, even at the age of 25 or so that he must have been. He was well known enough that putting his name on that pamphlet, on that announcement, made a difference. People knew him and would listen to him. So you can tell he must have been very charismatic. People were trusting him. So he took, and it also shows his courage because he could have been arrested for just that. So here's George. They have the provincial congress in July of 1775, and he is selected as the secretary of that body, takes a leadership role. He's on, I think, 2 or 3 different committees. He's very involved in that early government, and by December of 1775, he is selected as the president of the Council of Safety. So there's the British royal governor and their stuff over here, but if we want to be independent, we have to figure out how to run a government. So there's George, jumping right in. It's only a 25-year-old can, jumping right in with both feet. He's in the military, he's moving up, working with the militia, planning our defenses. And then early in 1776, he's elected to the Second Continental Congress, goes up to Philadelphia, votes on and signs the Declaration of Independence. George stays there in Philadelphia for 2 terms in Congress. They were about 9-month terms. So he stays for almost a year and a half, serves 2 terms, and really he stays in Philadelphia. He's part of a group that stays there even when the rest of the Congress decamps for, I think it's Maryland, as the British are coming closer. He plays, even as a young man, he plays a really important role. But then he comes down in late in 1777, comes back to Georgia because the British are coming. Well, first he has a couple things to do. He restarts his law practice. By September of 1778, he marries a young woman there in Savannah named Dorothy Camber. And he is involved, again, he's in the military. By this time, he's moved up really quickly. He, again, takes advantage of every opportunity. He is now a colonel in the Georgia militia. And by December, there are 3,000 British troops coming in by sea to Savannah. And we've got maybe 700 or 800 people in the Georgia militia. We are badly, badly outnumbered. So George, he fights in that first battle or first siege of Savannah. And it is one of the worst defeats the American forces face. Later in life, it's referred to as he survived the storm of Savannah. During that battle, the British capture Savannah and hold it, occupy it for the rest of the Revolution. And during that time, during that battle, George is shot in the leg. He is then captured by the British and held as a prisoner of war at Sunbury, a prison camp outside of Savannah, for 10 months. Now, the British give him good medical care, privileges of rank. He's the highest ranking prisoner of war, so I guess that meant something because they took care of his wounds. They even saved his leg. They didn't have to amputate, even with that injury. But he did have a musket ball in his leg for the rest of his life. So when he is released in exchange for a British officer, George gets back on his horse. They obviously took good care of him. He gets back up on his horse and he goes back to fight in the Revolution. After that time, he is twice governor of Georgia, 3 times the Chief Justice of the new state, as Georgia expands into that backcountry and makes first 2 and then 3 circuits. During the time he lived here at Meadow Garden in the 1790s, he's a circuit court judge, which means riding more than 100 miles a year on horseback to take care of legal matters in different areas. Also, while he lives here, he is a U.S. Senator for 2 whole months. So someone resigned, and he filled in the last 2 months of their term. And when you think about it, it would have taken 3 or 4 weeks just to get up to Philadelphia, even if everything went right on the trip. You could only ride, 25 miles a day or so. So he went up to Philadelphia for those 2 months, served as a senator, checked that box, had to do all the things. He was also on the committee that purchased the land and contracted the builders for Franklin College, this new institution of learning which became the University of Georgia at Athens. So he had his finger. He was also a trustee of Richmond Academy, and I've been transcribing those notes. He was showing up at every meeting, just about, and I think he was on the vestry of the church too. So it's like he was involved at the local, state, and national level. All 3 branches of government in the military for the rest of his life. And most people that visit with us have never heard of him, don't know his name, have no idea who it is. But I think a lot of the time, if you didn't eventually become president or get a Broadway musical made about you, we only think of those larger-than-life characters. And we forget that there were so many people who had a role in those early days of our country. There were people like George in every colony, people from every walk of life, every race, every faith, men and women, who were doing important things to give us what we have. And we don't know their stories. We only know his story because he signed a fancy piece of paper. So it reminds us to dig into our own family history and our own stories and our communities and our families and see what we can find, because there's a lot of good stories out there. I will say, George, I mentioned he married Dorothy Camber. They had 2 children. When they moved here to Meadow Garden in 1791, their oldest boy, Thomas, was about 9 years old. We had a 4th grade field trip that thought that was the coolest thing ever. And their younger boy, and here he is as an adult with the fabulous mutton chop sideburns there. When they moved here, George Walton Jr. would have been just 2 and a half. So those boys would have grown up here at Meadow Garden. Unfortunately, the oldest boy, Thomas, passed away in 1803. He had studied to be a lawyer, just got Esquire after his name. When he died, just a few weeks earlier, George had said everyone was well, so probably a short illness, but it devastated the family. A few months later, February 2nd, 1804, George himself the signer passes away. He's only 55 years old. In his obituary, which shows how prominent he was then, his obituary is bordered in black, very, very lengthy, very detailed, and it says that he had a short illness, but really got much worse, had a steep decline after the death of his eldest son. That left just George Jr. He was only just turned 15 when his father passed. He would have lived here with Dorothy, his widowed mother, and we don't have an image of her that we're certain of. I have a miniature I think might be Dorothy, but but we do have this image of George Walton Jr. Eventually, he grew up, studied law, became a military man, followed in the family footsteps as you do, and he married this lovely lady, Sally Walker. Now, both Georges married quite well. Both Dorothy Camber, the signer's wife, her family was quite well off. So was Sally Camber. So was Sally Walker. Her family had a plantation across town called Bellevue. So George and Sally as well had 2 children. Their eldest was Octavia. She was born around 1810. And her younger brother, Robert, born a couple years later. So they, again, would have grown up here at Meadow Garden for quite a few years. By 1821, George Walton Jr. Decides to make a name for himself on his own. He takes the position as the Secretary for the Territory of West Florida. So as that Florida's becoming a U.S. territory and its way to becoming a state. He's part of that government. He moves down to Pensacola with his wife, his children, and his widowed mother. So by 1821, we know all of the Waltons had left Augusta, certainly left Meadow Garden. They're in Pensacola. I think we have a note about Dorothy having a house fire. I said we don't know of any items that belonged to them during their time here. We may well have lost much just in that migration and also possibly within that house fire. Dorothy outlived George by, I think, 28 years. She died in 1832 there in Pensacola. But that was a good move for George Jr. because he is the namesake for Fort Walton Beach. So, you know, if you're going to have something named after you, I would not mind a beach. So he is, we'll talk a little bit more about George and his bunch as we come around, but I talk a lot more about the people than the stuff. So if you have any questions about any of the things, please do let me know, or any questions about anything any way along. It doesn't bother me a bit. Never mind being interrupted. I want to talk about the things that interest you most. So
Thanks. It's really interesting.
thank you. We think that this is a house full of some interesting characters for sure. We are going into the back of the two period rooms. Again, as we walk through, this is a restored doorway because we know that the Nelson family really changed a great deal about the house as they came in and built that extension. They plastered over the original door that we just walked past, the front door, and that was plastered over at some point. This passage between the rooms was also closed in. There was this little staircase. They've got a great big staircase out in the hall, so they removed this tiny little staircase that was here between these two rooms in this part of the house. Don't need that taken up room when you've got the other there. I will say our preservation team was very excited because they put a bigger passage between the rooms over here, and they put in a little broom closet kind of thing. It's what we used it for. But the preservation team came in and looked inside this little closet. And in that original plank wall from 1791, they could get so much information about the early house and the structure. So where wood is up against other wood over time, where it sits together, it leaves a mark. You can kind of see that on the walls where you can see where the lath was, where that's been removed, that the plaster and lath was there. So they could see these marks of the original joinery, even though it had been removed probably shortly after 1835. And as they went in there and looked at that, they found the outline, the ghost lines of the original staircase with an 11-inch rise, an 8-inch run. They could see how thick the stair treads were and how they curved as they came down into this room. They did some additional investigative removals in the ceiling. They found some of the plaster and lath from the earliest period of the house. They found also where the wall came down, the evidence for door frames, not just openings. And they found that little spot, that little opening that would bring light into the understair area. You only need to bring light into that area if you go in and close the door. So as you'll see, we have it dressed with a chamber pot. We can't know that's how they used it, but it's our best guess considering that it was certainly a more private space within this more private room. Of course, also, it's been, again, doing the preservation in the way we are is so good for our interpretation because as you see this, and you see these really, really steep stairs, and you think about George with a musket ball in his leg, trying to walk up those frightfully steep stairs. Now, maybe he did that every single day, twice a day. We've always dressed a room upstairs for George and Dorothy. We really think it's quite likely that they would have had a bedchamber or a bed on this floor, possibly in this room or maybe in the rooms to either side if we can confirm a little bit more about what those rooms were like. But in any case, as we do some new interpretation, we'll probably bring a bed down so that we can depict that idea for George and Dorothy. But so much of the furnishings and things in this time were built. They do tricks, like they were built for you to adapt your space. They're so clever. This table particularly, I think, the gate legs fold in, the sides fold down, tuck it up against the wall. Fold the sides up, there's your eating space for the family, and then all the cousins are coming over. That table and that table fit on the ends. There's little slots and tabs, so you've increased your floor space at the same time you've increased your eating space. And again, you can move it between the rooms, in those narrower sections. Very, very clever. There's other tables that tilt or drop leaves. There are lots of things to help you adapt your space to your needs. So the tiny house idea seems very new and modern, but I think they had it down back then. And we're always looking for clues within the building, within the structure. We're also looking for clues within our documents, and we're looking at newspaper accounts, letters, legal documents, anything we can find to get hints about what their life was like. We don't have any journals or account books, unfortunately, but we do have a few very valuable things like that deed of trust I mentioned earlier. In that, George tells us not only of the enslaved at Meadow Garden, he goes on to tell us what happened when he was released from being a prisoner of war. So George is released. George is called. He's supposed to go back up to his. He's supposed to go back up and call the legislature here in Augusta. You know, he's back in his unit, and again, the British are occupying Savannah. He wants to send his young wife Dorothy up to stay with family in Charleston. Well, she'll be safe. So he goes on to tell us that he puts Dorothy on a ship at that time, along with an enslaved woman named Chloe. We know from the later ages of the enslaved that Chloe's son Charles, or Charlie, would have been less than a year old. So enslaved woman Chloe, her babe in arms Charlie, and another enslaved woman named Clarissa. So 3 women and the baby get on the boat, off they go to safety in Charleston. During that trip, they encounter a storm. And during that storm, they're captured by the British frigate Guadalupe. That British ship must have known Dorothy was a person of some importance, because they removed Dorothy and her party from their ship, moved them to the British ship. That British ship is then, either in that storm or a subsequent one, blown off course. They end up in Antigua, down in the West Indies in the islands, where Dorothy, along with Chloe, baby Charlie, and Clarissa, are held captive by the British for 4 or 5 months. And again, George is telling us this. We don't know quite why he's telling us this. And as you look through, and again, by this time, the British definitely knew Dorothy was a wife of a member of Congress. So they say that one of the enslaved women, Chloe, can stay with her as her servant. But George tells us that they confiscated baby Charlie and Clarissa as spoils of war to be sold at public auction. All George then tells us is that Dorothy gave them 5 guineas, that would be about $900 today, and they allowed the infant Charles to stay with Chloe. It kind of buries the lead. This young woman they married quite young. Dorothy was still quite a young woman, had to go in and negotiate with her captors. We don't know her motivations. We don't know, why she did this, or at least the result is this mother and child were not separated. Clarissa was sold there in Antigua at public auction by the British in late 1779 or early 1780. We know no more about her. It's on our list of many things we want to do more research into. For a time, George thought Dorothy had died. This really, being captured by the British isn't the best thing that could happen to you, but in this case, it saved their lives. Their original ship went down in the storm. George thought Dorothy had died, but eventually he gets word that she is there in Antigua. And he and General Lincoln negotiate. Even though she's a civilian, the British want to exchange her for a British officer. They're going to get everything they can out of this. So they finally make that agreement. George has been elected to the Congress again. He is waiting in North Carolina. And bless their hearts, Dorothy and Chloe and baby Charlie have to get back on a ship in order to come home. But George waits there in North Carolina, and when they arrive, they all go up to Philadelphia, where they all live during his next term in Congress. So we so often think the entire revolution is about the guys in uniform and the ones signing the fancy documents. We so seldom have a window into what was happening to these people who really have little control over their own lives. Even women often don't make much of a mark in history. So we're very, very thankful to have this, even though it's a little confusing. We're not quite sure why he went to the point of doing this and why he's telling us all this, but we are very, very thankful that we have this document. And it's never enough information, but we always love to share whatever we have. We're going to be going back up the stairs across what would have been the Waltons' back porch, what is now the Nelsons' hallway, into the newer part of the house. You see the little kind of probably a signal cannon, maybe a repurposed ship's cannon. Our provenance says it was used in the Second Siege of Augusta and the Battle of 96. So, and in here, we're in the newer part of the house, and in here you can meet George and his co-workers. So there we have George in the center, along with our other 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence from Georgia. We have here the right there to George is Lyman Hall, one of 4 doctors who signed the Declaration of Independence. And over here is Button Gwinnett, one of the very best names in the entire American Revolution. Button was actually born in England, but really embraced his chosen colony. He was in the Georgia legislature, helped write the Georgia Constitution. He was also a general in the Georgia militia. And he got into a disagreement with a Continental Line general named Lachlan McIntosh. Actually, here is Lachlan. We put them in here so they can argue when we're not looking. So Lachlan, they were up for the same position as the leader of the military forces in Georgia, and I think Lachlan got that job, and then Button moved up so that he could boss around the guy that got the job he wanted, and how much fun is that? And then they argued about what to do about the British in Florida, and then they argued about whether or not Lachlan's brother was a loyalist, and they probably argued about whether or not the sky was blue. But eventually, and I think it was in the legislature, Lachlan called Button a low-down lying rascal. And if someone calls you a low-down lying rascal, what on earth are you going to do but challenge them to a duel? So they meet at dawn, go out, march out, turn and fire. They both hit the other in the leg, so fairly similar injuries between the two. But I've seen one account that said that Button Gwinnett's, the musket ball that hit him, actually broke his bone in his leg. This is May of 1777, less than a year after signing the Declaration. Button Gwinnett, 3 days later, he dies from his injuries from that duel, becoming the first of our signers of the Declaration to die. So something not anybody wants to be famous for. Here we have a print of the Declaration. Here are our Georgia signers. There's Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania. They had 8, but then nobody had to come that far for them. New Jersey, New York, all the way through to New Hampshire. So everyone signed with their colony in geographic order. There's a few out of place, like John Hancock of signature fame, big fancy signature there. He was justified in signing there because he was the president of the Congress. He would otherwise have been over here with Massachusetts, with John Adams. And you can really tell that among these 56 signers, there are 26 lawyers, like George, because it's really an indictment of the Crown. You'll see echoes of it in the courthouse even today as they bring charges before a grand jury. They are laying out their reasons for why this revolution was the right choice considering the British actions. And again, then it's this aspirational document, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet it says all men are created equal. And they certainly weren't treated that way at the time. It gives us so much to think about. It's been used by the suffragettes as they fought for the vote. It was used in the civil rights struggle. If this is what we say we're about, we should fulfill our promises. We are always open on free on the 4th of July every year, and we always read the Declaration aloud. This year, teachers will be reading the Declaration day after tomorrow. It's very soon. Mm-hmm. But it is so moving. That's how people would have heard it. It was sent out to military camps. It was sent out to towns, printed in newspapers. They wanted the world to know this declaration. And so we're very, very, very thankful for, it was such a dangerous thing to do. My goodness, I don't know if you have to be braver at 26 to do that or not. But yeah, definitely quite a thing. So we'll be coming into this, again, on the newer part of the house. This room, we have it dressed as the chapter room for the Augusta chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Those ladies, the local ladies that worked to save the house, they met here up through the 1920s and occasionally even later. I love, to think about them making those decisions about preserving this historic site as they sit here. And these ladies would have really would have looked up to this lady over here. This is, again, you've met her in the other room. This is Octavia Walton. So when they went down to Pensacola, there were lots of languages spoken, French and Spanish and Seminole. And Octavia picked up languages very quickly. They got her tutors. She was really very, very well educated. And this is the early 1830s, 1840s. So Octavia, then after their time in Pensacola, they moved to Mobile, Alabama. And there, Octavia here she is as a young woman, a young belle there with her Spanish guitar. Octavia met and married Henri Levert. His father came over with the French Expeditionary Forces and they settled here. He was a doctor. And she went by Madame Octavia Walton Levert and used it as an excuse to speak in a French accent whenever she felt like it. But she loved to traveled first with her father, later with her husband. She had 2 books, Souvenirs of Travel. They were published under her own name in the 1850s. She was Alabama's representative to the Paris exhibition, the only woman to have a role like that. She was a member of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. She raised $700 for the salon in her home to help purchase Mount Vernon. That group of ladies is still involved today, and she's still on the website for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association as the vice regent for Alabama at that time. Her fundraising was apparently quite exceptional. And you see beside you her salon chairs. So Octavia was very famous for these parties. Again, this larger-than-life character. She would have a salon every Monday, beginning at 11 a.m. and to 11 p.m. So it takes a lot of stamina to have a 12-hour party once a week, but she would invite in, a theater troupe. Come to my house. Oh, you've been traveling. Tell me all about it. You know, anybody, any artists, poets, musicians, anyone who liked to gossip, I think, was probably welcome. But she was just quite the character. And didn't even mention George Walton Jr. When they moved to Mobile, he was mayor of Mobile, had a law practice with his son Robert. Octavia and Henri had 5 children. A baby boy who died in infancy. There were 2 young girls who died the same year that Octavia's brother Robert passed away in 1849. He was just been elected mayor of Mobile, didn't even get to take office. He'd never married or had children, but there was, I think, a terrible scarlet fever outbreak. So that left only Octavia and Henri's eldest girl, also called Octavia. There she is as a young woman and as an adult. And the youngest daughter, Carolyn Henrietta. She went by Carinetta, or Henrietta Caroline, we're not sure, but anyway, she went by Carinetta, it seems. So Diddy was her nickname. Octavia, the younger there, never married. Only the youngest daughter, Carinetta, married. So Octavia is the only child of her generation to survive and to marry. And then only Carinetta marries. She marries in, I think, 1868. She marries a distant connection from here in Augusta and moves back to Augusta. And so she and Lawrence Reeb have 3 children, and this family is incredibly unfortunate. Only one lives to adulthood. This gentleman here, George Walton Reeb, who went to the University of Georgia, worked at the Athens Banner and the Augusta Chronicle, newspaperman, very literary, never married or had children in the family tradition. So he is the last living member of the family. He passed away in 1925, the last living member of the family that we know of. You never know what you don't know, but that we know of. He is the last living member of the family. And so they don't really have it. There were some of George's siblings settled here, other family members, but they really don't have any direct descendants to remember them. So we're very thankful that you came to find out a little bit about them today, and hope that you learned something new about this very interesting cast of characters that called Meadow Garden home.
Wow, what an awesome tour. That was Ransom, the executive director here at Meadow Gardens. And I had a one-on-one tour with her. It just worked out that way. She is incredibly knowledgeable. The wealth of information that she put in this video is amazing, and I am so grateful to her. Each tour down here is kind of tailored to those that go through. So perhaps when you come down, if you had questions about the furniture and more about the structure of the house, you can ask and they will tell us. So if you are ever in the area, if you live here, or you're going to visit family and friends, or you're just coming through, please come down and take a look. It is well worth it. Trust me. I had an amazing tour. Now I'm going to leave a link to their website in the video description below, and you can take a look at it. It lists their admissions and gives a history a little bit and a little bit more information than I can put here. I do hope you'll come visit Meadow Gardens. What a wonderful, wonderful place. Okay, folks, it's your turn. You know, to go out and explore this, that, and the other, the whatnots in your life. And until next time, Take care. Be safe. Bye.